we've got now a good sort of time period available to us for questions to the panel. I'll pick up some of the ones that we've already received in the chat, but also encourage any other questions to come forward if you have them. So I think looking at the chat, we had a question from Christie about the impact of the pandemic, and in particular how that's bringing forward new digital innovations and the role that that might play. I don't know whether, Chris, you want to elaborate on your question to the panel. Is Chris there?
Oh, hi.
Yeah, hello. Hi.
Hi,
Sorry.
hello. Yes, thanks very much for asking me to do that. I run a digital innovation business throughout the world, and we've done a lot of work in the US and the Far East and so on. And one of the things I do see is that the amount of innovations that are coming through that route have been greatly accelerated by the pandemic that we're currently experiencing. Because we've been remote working now for 5 or 6 years, and I've been inundated from very large companies to come and do that work for them, which I've had to say no, because I am fully committed. But what I do realize is that in my work, particularly in China, with the creation of smart cities, along with 5G networks and all the things that they create, is that there's a lot of work that can be done if the policymakers can get their act together and actually, as Dan said, fund it and create the structures that can support it.
Thank you. Does anyone from the panel like to respond to that point?
Can I say something very quickly, Jill, if that's okay? That I think one of the things that's come out of it, so it has speeded up things hugely. Crisis, burning platform, things have moved forward in terms of how we work, but also, how we're looking at the city. But I think one thing that's very useful about the crisis is shown that our society is vulnerable. And it's shown how quickly what we think is a stable, robust position collapses on a resilience issue. And, so it brings forward the fact that actually nothing can be taken for granted. We need to move forward swiftly and to take these issues seriously. And like I say, there's a whole range of different areas of resilience which have just been overlooked because we've been complacent. And I think that's, so, if we can take one lesson, it's we can't be complacent.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. That's really, yeah, absolutely very telling sort of impact, isn't it, of the pandemic, the fragility of a lot of our systems. I think as you rightly say. Don't know whether Dan or Becky, you want to come in with anything on the digital side of things.
I mean, I can maybe there's something about the links between digital innovation and regulation, because energy policy, which I know well, this differs across sectors obviously, but in terms of management of energy systems, that is the area where, I mean, as people know, ICT is having a huge impact, and it's also the area where you can actually, there's a real link with citizen engagement, because a lot of the ways in which you can engage citizens and actually people as consumers is through linking ICT and energy to create energy services. But the thing that's holding that back is really outdated regulatory structures, which, to their credit, the government has finally acknowledged in the energy white paper. But I think that the bigger picture here for me is that we need to think about the role that government has in actually shaping markets. And the energy system is entirely a creature of regulation, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it does show is that if that regulation is redesigned, it can actually change outcomes. So I think that maybe what we'll get through the experience of the pandemic and another wave of digital innovation as a result is more of an acknowledgement of that fact.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much. I think, Peter, you had a question about whether there were any differences between citizen-designed climate proposals and so-called expert ones. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Becky, you sort of, said it was all very beautiful that citizens went away and came up with the same kind of program as the experts in the end, but there must have been points of divergence. I'm particularly thinking about framing. The framing of the climate challenge and the solutions is done by experts like you and me. If other people are allowed to frame the problem and the solutions, how is that different?
Yeah, so I mean, there was just on Climate Assembly UK, there was a couple of areas where actually I ended up taking the flak for this when we did, when we presented the results to different groups, that the citizens didn't have the same views as environmental NGOs, particularly around flying and meat, as you can imagine. So they were relatively cautious on flying and meat. But I mean, that's an accurate representation, even when presented with the evidence and so on. And you could really tell that sort of tension coming out. So people who were themselves frequent flyers saying, oh, right, okay, maybe, we need to address this, but please, can you put it to the bottom of the list? So it really does highlight those tensions, which is useful. We need to know what those tensions are. But then I think what it showed for me as a sort of self-confessed policy wonk is that people don't think the same way that we do, and that's actually really useful. So in the Leeds citizens jury, which I went along to observe, there was a guy who worked out that so they'd been given a presentation about energy retrofit and how much money was needed to retrofit Leeds housing, the housing stock in Leeds, and they were also told how much the link road to the airport would cost. And so he said, well, just don't do the link road to the airport, spend it on the houses instead, which no one in government would suggest because it's different departments, different budgets, it's all like too difficult and complicated for any policy geek, but actually makes perfect sense. Why don't you think collectively about how to invest millions in your city and divert that the right way? So I find that kind of freshness of vision really useful, actually.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panel on that issue?
I'm not sure if I'm directly addressing that issue, but I really thought, Rebecca, that I think that's part of the argument I was trying to make about packaging. And I haven't thought this through properly yet, sort of commercially, but how do you package that investment opportunity to make it less unattractive, not only to policymakers, but to investors and delivery agents as well? On the tech piece, just jumping back, I was just thinking back to my good friend Rachel, I don't know if she's still with us, but her points to the consumption economy and how we tackle that. So a lot of what I was speaking to, I think, needs to necessarily be limited to a perimeter of emissions reduction that probably includes mostly sort of hardware, local hardware and related assets, right? So energy demand, obviously, some supply stuff plus transport, just to make it manageable. And then it has the interlinkages to grid and water and everything, obviously, around the edge. But the consumption economy is obviously a really difficult one for policymakers about this. The issue is telling people what they can do with their lives and their freedom. That's where, and I don't just mean social media, but where digital platforms and citizen-led change and cultural change can play a massive role in the decarbonisation story. I think that lives in a kind of integrated parallel world that's really important to solving the overall. So I just thought that just to give some support to the role of technology and digital solutions in creating collective action.
Great, thank you. Should also note that Simon is still here from this morning's session, and Simon, if you've got kind of contributions in respect to Malmo that you want to feed into this discussion, please do join in, because we're quite UK centric. So I'd like to invite you, if I may, to join in and comment on any of the questions and issues that have cropped up this afternoon.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's good to hear a different system and get a view of that when we're really snowed in on our part. When it comes to digital transformation, I mean, we have the same experience. We probably progressed more in a year than we would have in 10 years. And I have to say, when it comes to regulation and laws here, when it comes to political gatherings, city councils and so forth, we have strict rules that everyone who participates or elected member needs to be able to see everyone else in a similar fashion. And even like to change those rules or try to work around them has been quite the challenge, I have to say. And obviously there's a lot of political bodies across Sweden who are like fighting with this. but then again, no one is traveling as much as they used to. So when it comes to energy systems, we also have the same kind of issue. We have regulation and laws that disallow certain housing units to connect and make smart grids. So we have that part too, but it's very interesting to listen in to see the challenges that you have, even though I'm not familiar with all the parts. One last thing, I think Dan was touching on, the different levels, and we are facing that same challenge, because part of the public transportation is with the regional government, part is with us. It's steered by different political fractions, so then you have some possible conflict there. So we're trying to affect all the things within our border, but some of it is actually decided by other entities.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, Simon. I'm moving on to, I think, a question from another Simon Power. You question about priorities, I think, Simon. Would you want to give your question to the panel?
Some of the speakers have touched on it, but I just, in some ways, playing devil's advocate today, in Dan and Rebecca, we've got two different sides of the story. I suppose my question provocatively, we need both, presumably, but possibly, as you touched on right at the beginning, Rebecca, is decarbonising infrastructure ultimately an awful lot easier for government to deal with than a mass programme of behaviour change, for want of a better description. If we all put on woolly jumpers, the need for some of this renewable energy and offshore wind farms would probably go away. Sort of discuss, if you see what I mean.
Do you want me to come in there, Jill?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's really interesting that it always gets presented as an either or. It's sort of either, system change or individual change. It's either, infrastructure and technology, or it's behaviour change. And I mean, it's obviously intimately connected, and infrastructure of the past and present dictates, or at least greatly influences, behaviour. So you look at the fact that a lot of places in the US don't have pavements. That dictates whether people walk or not. Cycle lanes dictate whether people cycle or not, to a large extent. So that interaction between infrastructure and behaviour is really crucial. And if you think of people as individuals and consumers, then you assume that they don't have any control over that infrastructure. But I mean, the infrastructure is ours, right? We pay for it through our taxes. The problem is that there's no obvious linkage between. So the kind, in looking at citizen engagement, I absolutely think that citizens should have a role to play in deciding what infrastructure their city should be investing in. And I think that voting every few years is not enough of is not enough of an endorsement. That we're missing out a lot of really valuable expertise that people have in their own lives that they could play into infrastructure decisions, particularly on things like transport and travel.
I agree. Just to add on quickly there, I mean, I think it's an interesting one, particularly in cities, right? The infrastructure challenge is largely the fabric of people's lives, not their entire lives, right? But just in physical terms. So it's not like building a power station in the middle of nowhere with some issues to manage. You literally talk about the way people travel to work, or the way the homes people live in, etc. So it by its very nature, it's going to be an engagement issue. It needs to be a thorough process. It needs to be sort of fundamentally part of the solution, I guess. I'm just trying to point out how intrinsically linked the two things are in the real world, and therefore you can't separate them at all. Also, the vast amount of the investment, obviously through tax revenues, but also through private investment in domestic property, is going to be how it happens. So if people don't want to do it, we're not going to decarbonize. Okay, so, and good luck to whoever manages to ever solve the problem of insulating Victorian homes and installing heat pumps in them. it's you know, nobody's got 14 grand in their back pocket to do that, and somehow we need to work with people and with their homes and their travel plans and everything to make it all come together. So my point is just that it's totally integrated. I think that's why it's so difficult in truth. But we have to find a way to restructure the heat problem in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Any other comments from the panel on that question? If not, we can move on to, I think we've got a question from Oleg, which is touches on a theme that we've covered in a few of the presentations today. So the impact of any net zero policies and strategies on equity, on fairness issues. Oleg, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Jill. It is really interesting. And apparently we are talking about such big fundamental structural changes in society. And of course, with such transitions, we always have losers as well as winners, because we try to sort of emphasize the win-win solutions and so on. But inevitably, we need to think about sectors and actors who might be left behind in this process. So I was wondering what the panel might have any thoughts about that. Who would be those actors and industries who would be maybe losers in this process, and how we can deal with them in a fair manner? Thanks.
Over to the panel. Anyone? It's a big question. I appreciate that.
I think Rebecca and I look like we're both happy to give part of it a go. Do you want to go first, Rebecca?
I go for it, Dan.
Okay, I'll give a few points. There's lots of this. Who's going to? I was just trying to sketch a quick list in my sort of theme of very real world analysis. So who's going to lose out? Right, there's loads of money that needs to be spent on it. So those who pay lots of tax will be contributing. Whether that's losing out or not, I don't know. There'll be a load of disruption, right? Because there's loads of stuff to dig up and replace and everything, and change. So change is disruption. So we'll all have to face a certain amount of that. I think probably the biggest theme, though, is around this just transition language that we use in the UK and some international policy circles. I think it's about the jobs that will no longer exist in their current form and how we can convert those roles into being part of the green recovery and a new green economy. And it's not that those two things can't net off against each other. They probably can in absolute employment terms, or even be a net green growth improvement. However, the transition period that catches people, at 58 years of age or something in their career, and whether they can repurpose and reskill in an appropriate timescale to be part of that transition is the real challenge. Now, we could go on forever, I'm sure, about skills. It's a sort of favorite combo that I never really follow very well. But basically, how do we structure an entire skills base at all levels and parts of the transition economy? And I think that's where the solution lies. But again, it's another wickedly complex problem. Rebecca, I'd be really interested in your views.
Yeah, I mean, I agree and very much with your relentlessly practical focus as well. I think that's, it's that level of brass tacks that we need to get down to, isn't it? I mean, I think what you do with losers is the ultimate question for politics. It's a really tricky one, but I think I would just make the decision between individual people and communities losing and institutional or corporate losers. So for individual community level, this comes back to what you were saying about, planning for a just transition. At the moment, I think that language has been very much appropriated by the left, particularly because it's been sort of imported from the US, from the Democrats. I think it's, and so there is a solution to that sort of put forward on the left. I don't think we have the equivalent on the right at the moment in politics. I don't think we have a worked through view for what happens to jobs and communities who stand to lose out unless we plan for it carefully. So I think that's a real gap at the moment. In terms of institutional or corporate losers, I think we need to be a lot more explicit about that. So I think we're far too polite with high carbon interests. You know, I sort of play bingo with myself about how long it takes me in events to mention the Cumbrian coal mine, but you know, this is now my mention. You know, the fact is that we've been far too polite with high carbon interests, fossil fuel extraction, airports, you know, manufacturers of petrol and diesel SUVs and so on. We need to be absolutely upfront that there are some things we need to phase out, and we need to do that for the sake of those companies and shareholders and our pensions, so that they have a really clear path to change. And we've done nobody any service by continuing to fudge things to such an extent that somehow we've allowed a coal mine that pumps 9 million tonnes of carbon into the air every year to be opened. Same with Heathrow runway and so on. So I think that politics needs to get a lot sharper on the question of how we deal with corporate or institutional losers.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from the panel on that issue? And I think actually we've probably run out of questions as well. We've certainly had, I think, a really interesting Q&A though, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your input and for the panel responses. Perhaps we can sort of move to wrap up then, really, conscious of everyone's time. I've certainly taken away an awful lot from today's session, and would like to say a huge thank you to Peter in particular for organising it and for bringing together such a great group of speakers. I think it's been a really interesting and informative event, so thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to Ethan as well, of course, for valuable support in the background, which, as we know with these things, is so important and often easy to ignore. So, you know, huge thank you to Ethan. Of course, thank you to panelists as well. I mean, I think I've certainly from this afternoon's session got some really key takeaway points, I think, around how tackling the net zero challenge requires a transformation. I think Andrew put it really well. It requires a wider transformation of ways of working, of organisational structures, and so on. And I think all the panelists have really highlighted the scale of the task ahead and the delivery challenge. And Dan, I think in particular, you've done a great job at telling us and reminding us that this requires systemic change. It requires that complex development of interventions and change that is often so challenging, but I think you've articulated that incredibly well. And Becky, I think in particular, really reminding us forcefully that citizen engagement shouldn't just be the add-on or maybe something that we think is going to be too difficult, but actually it's hugely valuable, important, and actually does lead to effective outcomes, positive change, and there's a real appetite for that. So I think those messages, I think, will certainly resonate and have resonated with me particularly. Just by way of how we'll take forward some of the points that have been discussed here. Clearly, each of you will take away a lot, I'm sure, from this session, and these ideas and themes will certainly be an ongoing debates and issues around this in the school. Peter, I think you're going to write up a note on the session for Medium, which I think will be published shortly, so do keep an eye out for that. We'll share the link as soon as that's available. And we'll also feed the main points from today's discussion into Nigel Topping, the UK champion for COP26. And we'll also help the team with preparations for the Conference of the Parties in November. So certainly we won't see this as an end point. We'll take forward a lot of the themes and issues raised. And I'll also leave you with an invitation to let us know either now or if you want to follow up with an email, if there have been particular themes that you think would be great to maybe devote another session to. We could arrange another workshop perhaps on one of the themes that's been particularly interesting or you felt we could have had a bit further discussion on today, we'd be happy to arrange a follow-up conversation, and certainly we'll hope to keep in touch with you all as we all take forward and do our bit to address this issue. I don't know whether, Peter, you want to say anything by way of final points and comments?
Jill, I think you've summed up really well. I would just ask then put Becky and Dan on the spot with leaving us each with a positive message about what they see that's going to really help tackle the climate crisis and move cities forward in the future. And it's always really good. It can be overwhelmingly depressing dealing with the climate change issues, but to end on a positive note, that would be a really good way to end. But I'll just add my thanks to everybody for participating and for all of you who've been watching.
I think, Peter, my positive note would be that in all the time I've worked on the climate agenda, I've never seen so much political momentum. And that is, thanks to the cities who, as we've seen in the US, the cities kind of carried on and carried the flame even when the federal government was not quite so keen. And, I think we're seeing so much political focus on this now, and that is going to lead to, already has and will continue to lead to change. So at a very general level, I feel like we're in a good place. Whether it's quick enough, I can leave you with that cliffhanger, but that does give me a lot of optimism, definitely.
Thanks, Becky. And I would just add that, we haven't really talked much about the private sector here. I didn't really introduce myself properly either. I mean, I work at PwC, and we work with many of the world's largest corporations on their net zero strategies now. And, for those of you who might have a sight of it, I mean, you should see the scale of interest, excitement, board level, C-suite support. I don't know if anyone heard Larry Flint on Radio 4 this morning. Just the amount of activity is enormous. So I think business is finally pulling its socks up and is willing to play its role. So combined with that political will that Becky mentioned, I think there's a platform now that after 20 years working on these issues in all sorts of ways, I am super excited. And I think COP26 is going to be a massive turning point for, policy into delivery. So I think we've got an enormous opportunity in the UK and internationally in November to really light the touch paper.
Thank you very much. Great to end on such a positive note. Thank you once again to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for attending today and for your contribution. It's really appreciated. Hope you all have a good weekend and hope to keep in touch and speak soon.